Welcome to this, the very first episode of our new podcast, Where the Monsters Are. I'm Lou, and I'm your host for this episode, and I'm here with Sarah.
Hi there.
And this one is for you super sleuths out there who like a tale of true crime. We're staying close to home for this one. As we're both from Birmingham in the UK, we thought we would take one of our local legends as our first story to tell you about. So firstly, can I just ask a question? Who's ever watched the Peaky Blinders?
I have.
I should hope so. Even if you haven't watched it yourself, you may have heard of the TV show that's made by the BBC. Follows the exploits of the Shelby family, criminal gangsters of Irish travel origin, led by Tommy Shelby, who's played by Cillian Murphy. He has got nice eyes, I will say. Now, before we go...
And the cheekbones.
Yeah, you do like the cheekbones.
I do, yeah.
Now, before we go any further, I just want to take this opportunity to say, if you enjoy this episode, please check out our website. We're at www.wherethemonstersarepodcast.com, and also you can follow us on our social media. And don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on, because it does really help the podcast. And now, if you're ready, let's begin. So, as I mentioned before, we're both from Birmingham. We thought we would take one of our local legends as our first story to tell you. So we chose the Peaky Blinders. They were a gang of criminals who pretty much ran things in central Birmingham for about 30 years at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th centuries. When the BBC show starts, it's 1919, and that's just after the end of World War I. They've changed this in the show in that Tommy Shelby is really quite powerful at this time. But that's very different to the real Peaky Blinders, because they were coming to the end of their influence in the city as they were slowly being pushed out by another street gang, and they were the Birmingham or Brummagem Boys.
I wonder if they'll ever make a TV show about them.
Well, you got to wonder, because I mean there was mention of, what was his name, Billy Kimber. He was quite a famous one. He was the leader of the Brummagem Boys.
Ah.
And I think he was quite a good character when he was on the Peaky Blinders, so it could happen. I'd watch it.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to go through a bit of background about the show in case you never have actually watched it. In the first series, the gang comes to the attention of Chester Campbell, and he's played by the great Sam Neill, who I do really like, and he's hired by Winston Churchill to deal with the growing criminal activity in the city. Though it's never been confirmed by the showrunners, I think it's likely that Campbell was modelled after someone called Charles Horton Rafter, and he was an Irish police chief who tried to bring down the real Peaky Blinders. I'll tell you a bit more about Rafter later and what he did in the city to try to fight against the street gangs.
Well, he was horrible though, that Sam Neill, the character he played.
He's very different to what the real Rafter was.
Oh, okay.
Because he actually did a lot of good for this city, so...
Oh.
Yeah, he was very different.
Okay.
The next few seasons of the show covered Tommy Shelby's ambitious rise to power, from gangster to eventually being elected as a Member of Parliament. The show has received critical acclaim and has a few famous fans, from author Dennis Lehane to singer Snoop Dogg and the late David Bowie, who is one of my favourite artists. I'm not exaggerating when I say Labyrinth is in my top favourite movies, and like a lot of girls, I definitely had a crush on Jareth the Goblin King.
Yeah, it must have been his cod piece.
Well, that did have something to do with it, I won't lie.
Oh.
When he found out that he was a fan of the show, Cillian Murphy actually gave David Bowie one of the hats that he wears in the show as Tommy Shelby.
Oh, okay.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the differences now to the real Peaky Blinders compared to those in the show. In the show, they're portrayed in an almost glamorous way, charismatic and dressed well in three-piece suits, crisp white shirts with a stiff collar and a newsboy-type cap. In real life, that's very far from the truth. They mostly had real jobs, ranging from metal workers to barmen, and didn't belong to one powerful gang like those in the show, so they didn't make any of their money from high-level gangland activity. The real Peaky Blinders were backstreet thugs. They were gangs who preyed on the hard-working, law-abiding citizens who lived in the poorer neighbourhoods of the city. So why were they called the Peaky Blinders? Legend has it that the name was actually taken from disposable razor blades that they stitched into the peaks of their caps. During fights, they would whip the hat off and slash it on their opponent's forehead, which would cause the blood to run down their face, which prevented them from seeing. They could then finish off the fight while their opponent was blinded. But there are some historians who believe that it's more likely that the Peaky Blinders' weapon of choice would have been belts and their steel-capped shoes, mainly because razor blades were only just becoming available in the UK after the war and would have been expensive.
Well, couldn't they have just stolen them? You know, if they're criminal gangsters.
Yeah, they could have done. But they think that the razor blades are thought to have been inspired by a novel by a man named John Douglas. It was called A Walk Down Summer Lane. And that's where Billy Kimber, who was the leader of the Brummagem Boys, lived.
What, Summer Lane?
Yeah, Summer Lane. Birmingham historian Professor Carl Chin believes the thugs thought of as Peaky Blinders may have gotten that nickname because of their fashion and style choices. I've found some pictures of these, so I'll include them on our Instagram for you to have a look at. According to Professor Chin, they wore bell-bottom trousers tight to the knee with wide collarless shirts and a long hanky knotted at the front. Some wore billycock hats, not flat caps, with closely cropped hair that was quiffed to one side, which was known as a peak. That was the fashion, and they liked to show it off by having it cover one of their eyes, which was where peaky came from, and blinder was slang for their well-dressed appearance. Their girlfriends were also very distinctive in how they dressed. In his book The Gangs of Birmingham, Philip Goodison described them as a lavish display of pearls, the well-developed fringe obscuring the whole of the forehead, and descending nearly to the eyes, and the characteristic gaudy-coloured silk handkerchief covering her throat. Some of the girlfriends said that some of them were often violent toward them. One of them actually said he'll pinch and punch you every time he walks out with you, and if you speak to another chap, he won't mind kicking you. Sounds golden. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Birmingham was like back then. Birmingham has changed a lot in the last 200 years. It started off as a market town, moving relatively quickly into the fastest growing city of the 19th century. This was mainly because of a combination of civic investment, scientific achievements and commercial innovation. By the 20th century, it was the UK's main area of manufacturing and automotive industry and earned itself the reputation of a city of canals and cars. I had heard this before, but when I checked, I found out that Birmingham actually has 35 miles of canal, which is actually more than Venice.
Yeah, I mean, I knew we had quite a lot, but I didn't really realise it was more than Venice.
Yeah, that's a lot of canals. The biggest improvement to Birmingham was arguably the emergence of the city as the centre of metalworks, and it was indeed at the centre of the Industrial Revolution. There was a lot going on in Birmingham at that time. A wide variety of goods were manufactured here, ranging from buttons, cutlery, nails and screws, guns, tools, jewellery, toys, locks and ornaments. I mean, we actually have a gun quarter and a jewellery quarter in Birmingham, don't we?
The jewellery quarter is really still quite relevant, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Large factories became common toward the end of the century when engineering industries became increasingly important. Merchants were allowed to fund the construction of some really quite beautiful buildings in the city, including these, which still stand today. There's the Town Hall that was built in 1834, the Botanical Gardens, which opened in 1832, the Council House, which was built in 1879, and the Museum and Art Gallery, which was opened in 1885, which I think we've probably been to all of those at some point or another.
I go to shows at the Town Hall quite a lot, and I mean, it is an amazing building.
Oh, it is, yeah. It's quite interesting how good it still looks, considering how old it is as well.
Well, yeah, and the art gallery.
I can remember going there quite often when I was little. You go to the Science Museum and the Art Gallery, because they were a 2-for-1, weren't they? You'd go to one and then the other. At the beginning of the 19th century, Birmingham had a population of about 74,000. By the end of that century, it had grown to a whopping 630,000. That rapid growth meant that by the middle of the century, Birmingham had become the second largest population centre in Britain. This wasn't all a good thing, though, because the increased population, unfortunately, meant that they obviously had to find somewhere to live. If you were poor, it wasn't good to be living in Birmingham during the Victorian era. Many poor families lived in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Sewers weren't finished under Birmingham until 1904, so you can imagine what it must have been like to live in those conditions.
Ugh.
Thousands of back-to-back houses were built to house the growing population, many of which were poorly built and soon became slums. Some of the back-to-backs are now set up as a tourist attraction to show what life was like for the people who lived there. The mayor of Birmingham at the time was social reformer Joseph Chamberlain. He later became an MP for Birmingham. He wanted to make sure that people lived in decent homes, so he made sure that the worst of the slums were cleared. That didn't help everyone though, and people still lived in some of these poorer areas and were constantly attacked on a regular basis by the street thugs of the different gangs. So on the outside, Birmingham was seen as a well-governed city that was admired for its municipal socialism and activism. But the poorer neighbourhoods were being attacked by these vicious backstreet gangs. Inner city Birmingham was poor, full of overcrowded slums and extreme poverty, full of crime and ruled by street gangs. Murders, robberies, thefts and riots were a daily occurrence. There were mass brawls between the street gangs as they tried to keep control of areas of Birmingham, such as Small Heath and Cheapside. These consisted of hundreds of youths fighting, sometimes to the death, in mass brawls that lasted for hours. The gangs that were most prominent and ruthless of the early gangs were known as the Brummagem Boys and the Sloggers, who were also known as the Cheapside Slogging Gang. Small Heath is an area in the southeast of the city. I myself have a connection to this area because my mum and dad were born and raised here just after the end of World War II. They didn't know it at the time, but they actually lived one street away from each other but didn't meet until years later when they were teenagers. I'd never heard of Cheapside, but when I looked into it, I found that it wasn't a district like Small Heath is, but is in fact a street. It looks as though the name comes from the Bullring area of the city. Before it was cleared in the 18th century by the streets commissioners and was known as Corn Cheaping, which meant corn market, which was what originally stood on the site. The Bullring is the main shopping area in the city centre, and I'm sad to say that the name Bullring referred to a green within Corn Cheaping that was used for bull baiting. The ring was a hoop of iron to which bulls were tied for baiting before slaughter.
Cruel.
Yeah, not pleasant. For 30 years, the Sloggers were the gang to be feared. They used protection rackets and violence to instill fear in the residents of the city. The gang was led by a man named John Adrian, and his lieutenant was James Grinrod, and they began to come to power around 1870. Their weapon of choice was a heavy buckled belt that they used to beat both male and female victims of all ages so that they could mug them.
Terrible.
I know. This is the thing. It's quite funny because you watch the show and the show kind of puts it out that they're kind of above all that, but they were just common criminals. That's all they were.
Mm-hmm.
There was a Birmingham Mail report in 1872 which described a riot of sorts that the Sloggers started. The riot was made up of 400 what they called roughs who brought indiscriminate violence to the Cheapside area, attacking and stealing. As there wasn't a huge body of police officers in Birmingham at that time, a small amount of officers were sent to try and deal with them. Of the 400 thugs who were rioting, only 3 arrests were actually made, which speaks to how few officers there must have actually been there. After the police showed up, the rioters moved on to the Hill Street area, where they threw bricks and stones at the windows of local shops. This is now at the back of where the mailbox is, which is an upmarket centre holding shops, offices and even a cinema. Notorious sloggers included Aston's The Simpson Brothers and George Cloggy Williams, whose notoriety grew quickly after the 1897 killing of PC George Snipe. PC Snipe was killed in 1897 after being hit on the head by a brick. His death actually helped to change the style of the helmet that police officers wore so that they were better protected. Prior to his death, there wore a helmet with a spike on it, and again I'll include a picture on our Instagram. It was wrongly supposed by his colleagues that when he was hit by the brick, the spike went into his head, killing him. His colleagues then refused to wear these helmets, and they were very quickly changed to remove the spike. The policeman, who was 29 when he died, was called to a disturbance at closing time in a pub on Bridge Street West, which is in the Hockley area of the city. Hockley is about a mile northwest of the city centre. A crowd threw stones and punched and kicked PC Snipe and his colleague after they arrested 2 men. Police later arrested Cloggy Williams, a slogger who was convicted of manslaughter and given a life sentence. PC Snipe was buried in an unmarked grave in Warstone Lane Cemetery in what we mentioned earlier, the Jewellery Quarter, which is very near to the city centre.
Well, that comes under Hockley, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I'll now tell you about some of the most notable members of the gang. In the BBC drama, the Garrison pub is a major location. Garrison Lane is an area that still exists today. In fact, my family lived on Garrison Lane until I was about 3 years old. Obviously, having moved out there when I was very young, I don't really remember anything about living there.
Maybe you was related to the Peaky Blinders, or some of them.
Maybe, who knows? I don't really remember anything about living there, and I don't remember being a Peaky Blinder, but you know.
Well, you wouldn't have been, I wouldn't hope. I know I say you look old for your age, but...
Well, I don't remember my dad being one either, as far as I know.
It was your mum.
My dad told me about being able to watch Birmingham City football matches on a weekend from our balcony because our masonette was right next to the football grounds. You being a Villa fan, I'm sure you're happy about that.
Well, I was going to call him a cheapskate, but, you know, couldn't be bothered to pay and go and watch him. What kind of a fan was he?
No, living on a budget, that's what it was. The football grounds, named St Andrews, were built on Garrison Lane in 1906, so it's conceivable that as there were matches back then, some of the Peaky Blinders may have gone to matches themselves, since the Garrison Tavern, which was the Peaky Blinders' local pub, was on the same road. In fact, the Garrison Tavern was sold in 2014 after it stood closed for a year and was unfortunately not opened again. The creator of the show, Stephen Knight, was actually trying to get a consortium together to buy it so they could reopen it as a pub. I don't know what the status is of his plan at the moment, but it'll be a shame if it remains closed considering its long and checkered history.
Yeah, I mean, that would be quite a good tourist attraction because I'm sure there's a Peaky Blinders bar in Liverpool.
Oh, is there?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. But, you know, that was the actual pub where they used to drink, so you couldn't get much more authentic than that, could you?
No, you couldn't. I mean, in tourists alone, the show is actually still going on, so you'd think that would be a bit of a moneymaker for them.
And even when the show ends, people still go and visit the areas, don't they?
Yeah, definitely. Back in the late 1800s, the Garrison Lane slums were home to a man named Henry Lightfoot, who I mentioned earlier. He was one of the first to be referred to as a Peaky Blinder. It was the Birmingham Daily Post which originally coined the phrase Peaky Blinder back in 1895, and it appears this was the first mention of the gang as this. Before this, the gangs were only known as sloggers. Like so many others in the same boat as him, Henry Lightfoot had a tough upbringing. He was a petty criminal whose crimes ran to such things as stealing scrubbing brushes, racing pigeons, and, get this, football.
Football?
Football. When I originally found out he'd been arrested for football as a crime.
Playing football?
Football, the game football. I immediately thought, football, how's that a crime? But yes, when I looked into it, I found out that the game was actually illegal before the Football Association laid down the current laws, and that was in the 19th century.
Why?
I don't actually know, but it was at that time it was only allowed for limited periods in specific parts of the country, and Birmingham was obviously one of those areas, at least for a short time. Now I wonder if it's connected to perhaps gambling.
Maybe, yeah.
Because if people were betting on the outcome of it, that's the only thing I can think of.
But then they used to have horse racing at that time, didn't they? That was gambling. So if gambling was illegal, why did they have stuff like that?
Don't know. I couldn't actually find why it was a crime, but it just said that until the Football Association brought in the rules that are there now, it was actually a crime to play football, but not everywhere.
Well, maybe if anyone listening knows why football was illegal, they could let us know.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to find out why football was a crime. Although, to be fair, I don't really like football, so I think it's a crime now, to be honest. Henry Lightfoot was known for his numerous fights with the law, such as the time he single-handedly took on the Hay Mills police, captured and tied one of them at gunpoint to a tree in Hay Barnes Reek. I mean, I know it sounds a little bit comical when you hear it like that, but I mean, tying them at gunpoint?
I don't find it comical. In fact, I'm more convinced you're a descendant of the Peaky Blinders.
Because I'm seeing the funny side of it. Lightfoot's petty criminal status changed in 1895. Okay, yeah, I'm going to take it back. You're right with this next bit. His criminal status changed in 1895 when his name went into the history books after a vicious attack in a pub where he tried to stab a policeman. He was later sent to prison for manual labour and labelled a Peaky Blinder of the worst kind. After he got out of prison, he went on to enlist in the military during World War I, but his anger would again get the better of him. He was thrown out of the army after he attacked someone, but rejoined as a volunteer before being wounded at the Battle of the Somme. Despite his vicious ways, Lightwood did find redemption, as it appears that after he was wounded he never got into trouble with the law again, and in fact returned from the war a changed man. That seems to be a familiar story for many of the men who return from the battlefield, as many of them left their old lives of crime behind them. For the worst of the Peaky Blinders, most of them were in jail during World War I for manslaughter and other crimes anyway, so they never actually got to the war. The most powerful member of the Peaky Blinders was Kevin Mooney. He was born Thomas Gilbert, but routinely changed his name. As the youth gang culture began to take over the streets of Birmingham, entire areas fell under the control of the groups, with land grabs a common source of rivalry between gangs. Mooney was a major instigator of these activities, and soon the Peaky Blinders became a singular entity, operating in favourable areas and communities in Birmingham.
So was that Kevin Moody?
Mooney.
Mooney. Was he meant to be like Tommy Shelby's character?
Maybe. I think what they've probably done is they've picked different bits of the real characters and given them to the characters in that. Because you've obviously got, I can't remember his name, the brother, is it Arthur?
Arthur, yeah.
He's obviously an angry man. So I'm guessing that's where they've sort of bought some of this from.
Okay.
Now, bear in mind it's after the war in the Peaky Blinders, because it was 1919 in the show.
Yeah.
But when these guys were about, it wasn't necessarily after the war, so they were angry anyway. But I think a lot of it's got to be because of poverty. I mean, the things they were living with. So unfortunately, they took it out on a lot of innocent people when they were mugging them with their belts and stuff. On the 23rd of March 1890, a group led by member Thomas Mucklow attacked younger man George Eastwood after seeing him order a non-alcoholic ginger beer at the Rainbow pub in Adderley Street in Digbeth.
Non-alcoholic?
Yep. The outnumbered victim suffered serious bodily contusions, a skull fracture and multiple lacerations on his scalp. He actually spent more than 3 weeks in hospital and even had to undergo trepanning, which is where doctors drill into the patient's head to relieve pressure.
And this is just because he had a ginger beer that wasn't even alcoholic? Oh, no.
Unless there was another reason for it, but yeah, it does seem a bit extreme, you know. Mucklow, who was the guy who attacked him, was a carter, which was a driver of a horse-drawn vehicles for transporting goods. He lived in Adderley Street, the same street as the pub, and was the only gang member identified. The 26-year-old would go on to be found guilty of unlawfully and maliciously causing grievous bodily harm and was sentenced to 9 months hard labour in Birmingham prison.
It's not a long time, is it? 9 months?
No, it's not.
What would hard labour be? Do you know?
No, I didn't really look into it, but I think if it's anything like what you think of as hard labour, you'd be building and knocking things down. I'm not 100% on that, but I would imagine hard labour is you working. You're not sitting in a cell playing your PlayStation and stuff.
Well, not in them days.
No, I guess not. 2 weeks after the beating, the London Daily News identified the perpetrators as members of the Small Heath Peaky Blinders, which represents the earliest known written reference to the gang. Before this, as I said before, they were known as sloggers. It was interesting to me to find out that George Eastwood, the guy who was attacked, lived in Arthur Street, Small Heath, because Arthur Street is where my dad lived growing up. Small world.
I told you.
Peaky Blinders.
Mm-hmm.
Who knew? Some of the most well-known members included Harry Fowles, whose nickname was Babyfaced Harry. He was arrested in October 1904 for stealing a bicycle.
Oh.
Fellow members also caught around the same time included Stephen McHickey, who was arrested for breaking into a draper's shop 11 doors away from his own home. Not the smartest of things to do, I would have thought. And Ernest Haynes, he also was arrested for stealing a bicycle, although they were only put away for a month before they were back on the streets again causing trouble. West Midlands police records show a number of arrests for criminal activities that ranged from mugging, theft, and in the case of 13-year-old David Taylor, carrying a loaded firearm. Law enforcement, as I mentioned before, found it difficult to keep control of the expanding activities and different members of the group. It was the older gang members who were in charge, such as the leader Tom Gilbert, Stephen McHickey and Harry Fowles. The others were loyal to them and did what they were told. It was hard to tell how many members were actually in the gang because some people only claimed to be for the status that it gave them. Small Heath and Cheapside were a main target for the gang in their land grabs because they wanted to gain control of the area. They already had a reputation for street fighting in some of the poorer areas, which became a common way to show their control. Their rising power was brought on by the fact that they had many prominent figures in business and law in their pockets, which meant they were unlikely to face punishment. The criminal gangs bribed many law enforcement officials, which meant that they could pretty much continue their criminal activities relatively unhindered. They ruled over the city for almost 20 years and became one of the largest criminal enterprises of the 19th century. They eventually expanded into other areas of criminal activity to include smuggling, robbery, bribery, protection rackets, fraud and hijacking. Their speciality, though, was still street-level crimes such as robbery and assaults. The honest authorities realised this couldn't be allowed to carry on, so they hired Irish-born Chief Constable Charles Horton Rafter, who I mentioned earlier. He was hired in 1899 and they tasked him with turning the nation's second city around.
This is Sam Neill guy?
Yeah, this is him. Though the makers of the show haven't confirmed it, it does seem likely that Inspector Campbell, who was played by Sam Neill, as you say, who is the main antagonist in season 1 of the show, is based on Rafter. He started a rapid recruitment drive and up to 500 additional police officers were hired. The fit young men, which is how they described them, that were hired, needed to have a certain standard of education, but also had to be tough with lots of physical training and weren't afraid to fight back if need be. After this, instead of being outnumbered by the gangs, the police stood a fighting chance of being able to overthrow the street gangs. They were able to conduct more arrests, which led to the second part of Rafter's plan, ensuring sentencing was more severe, which, as you said earlier, what they were getting before didn't really sound much.
Well, it's definitely not a deterrent, is it?
No, not at all. This in turn gave the law-abiding poor, who had mostly been the unfortunate victims of the criminal gangs, more confidence and led to a higher number of crimes being reported, having been too scared to report them before for fear of violent reprisals from the gang. These measures, along with social changes and the introduction of better leisure activities, even churches introduced boxing classes for the youth of the city. This made a dent in the number of people that the gangs could recruit. Rafter was one of the first chief constables to employ women in the service. To begin with, they were hired as what were called police matrons, who looked after female prisoners and children. Women were later recruited as volunteers to patrol the city parks and public spaces during World War I. A women's police department was formed in June 1917, and in 1929 the Royal Commission praised the Birmingham police force for being the first to include female police officers.
Oh, wow, so we were the first in the whole country to do that?
We were. By 1935, the Women's Police Department had 17 female officers and had its own office in Steelhouse Lane, which was opened as a new central police station in 1933. I think Steelhouse Lane is still there because I think they do like tours to soon gain the unwanted attention of the Birmingham or Brummagem boys. They were a street gang with influence that extended from the north of England to London's underworld. The Peaky Blinders' expansion of territory, especially into race courses, led to an escalation of violence that caused similar retaliation from rival gangs. Following this retaliation, members' families were moved away from central Birmingham, choosing to live instead in the countryside, far away from the violence of the city. In time, the Peaky Blinders' position of power was usurped by the Birmingham boys, led by Billy Kimbrough, who I mentioned earlier, who would take their place and dominate the criminal scene until the 1930s, when they too were defeated by the Sabini gang, both of which groups appear in the show. By the 1920s, the Peaky Blinders had all but disappeared. As they grew weaker, their name came to be used as a generic term to describe violent street youth, and as areas such as Small Heath grew, so did the physical distance between the rivals. According to Professor Chin, who I mentioned earlier, a lot of gang members didn't talk about their criminal past when they got older, as they were often ashamed of what they had done when they were younger. Most of the once feared names of the gang members are now forgotten, but their reputations are cemented in Birmingham's folklore. And that's all for the real Peaky Blinders. It's weird to me to think that these criminals, who in the TV show are portrayed as being big, powerful, ambitious gangsters, they weren't actually really that. Before I started my research, I just took what the show was portraying as being what the truth was, and I'm not saying they weren't dangerous, because they really were, but it's a little bit disappointing that they were just petty thugs. They were obviously a dangerous criminal gang, but compared to the fictional version on the BBC, they don't appear to have been as ambitious as Tommy Shelby.
Well, he went for Parliament, didn't he?
He did, yeah. There was no talk about any of that, and looking at the people involved here,
yeah,
I can't ever see any of them become MPs.
It's very different than the TV show. I mean, you know they're only going to be loosely based and they need to make them more engaging in the show. But it's interesting to see how very different it is.
Yeah, a bit of dramatic license has been taken. Okay then, so thanks very much for listening. Please let us know what you thought about this episode on our social media, and thank you so much for joining us for our first ever episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and follow us on whatever platform you're listening on. And please leave a review. It will really help us reach more people just like you.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for taking the time to listen to us. And we hope you enjoyed it.
And we'll have another episode out next Sunday.
Yeah, that will be my one.
It will be. Do you want to tell us anything about it?
It's a supernatural kind of story. It's well known. It's one of the most famous hauntings in the country. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thanks, Louise.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye.